This episode is brought to you by Progressive, a leader in boat insurance. Welcome aboard to Carefree Boating. Here, we don't worry about the what-ifs, because we explore with Progressive Boat Insurance for as little as $100 per year for a basic liability policy. Progressive also offers a variety of other coverages and can help you cover repair costs when you need it. And with discounts like multi-policy, safety courses, responsible driver, and more, your mind can really float free. Cruise on over to Progressive.com to get a quote today and see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Rate and discounts not available in all states or situations.
I'm Cindy Lauper. My psoriasis was all over, even on my scalp, which may mean 4 times the risk for psoriatic arthritis. But Cosentyx works on both.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some are fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at Cosentyx.com or 1-844-COSENTYX. Ask your doctor about Cosentyx.
If you were to listen to Donald Trump, the American president, you would think that Canada was a hotbed for fentanyl, that we were flooding the American markets. Well, if you listen to too many Canadians, we have no role at all. Where's the truth? Somewhere in between. Hi, I'm Brian Lilly. Welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. Today, we're going to be speaking to a professor who has looked at this issue. Jonathan Caulkins is the Stever University Professor of Operations Research and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. He recently had a paper out with the Manhattan Institute called Fentanyl at the Gates, comparing large seizures at the U.S.-Mexican and U.S.-Canadian borders. While we aren't major players in seizures of fentanyl going across the border, if you listen to Dr. Caulkins, we aren't innocent either. Here's our conversation. So, Professor Caulkins, the argument about the northern border, or I guess our southern border, and fentanyl has been, from the Trump administration, Canada's a real problem. From the former Trudeau government, there's no problem at all. From the current Carney government, there is an issue and we'll deal with it. My view has always been that we may not be the source of most of the fentanyl, but we're not nothing, and there is an organized crime element in here that Canada does need to take some responsibility for. You've looked at the seizures, you've looked at the supply chains. That's your specialty, organized crime supply chains. I love that. What are you finding?
I agree with the current perspective. That is, it's not nothing, but it's a very small proportion of the amount coming into the United States. So Trump doesn't have a basis for claims about floods coming in. But there are drugs moving, and it behooves both countries to cooperate and try to disrupt what is happening. Because the basic story is Canada and the United States suffer from this internationally sourced fentanyl, and that is moved by international criminal organizations. They are difficult to deal with. They're important to deal with, and the countries should be working together to try to address that threat.
But when you looked at counties and you went county by county, and you're not talking city or states, you're talking county. It's a very standardized political jurisdiction across the United States. Were there any counties touching the Canadian border where fentanyl coming across was a major issue?
Yeah, so you're right. The unit of analysis was counties. There are 3,000 of them in the United States, so it's a relatively fine-grained unit of analysis. The reason we use that is that's just the degree to which the data had been anonymized by law enforcement before they were released to us. Yeah, there were just basically 3 that stood out relative to their population. That last caveat is there's a county called Wayne County that includes Detroit. It is on the border with Canada. You find a fair amount of fentanyl there, but that's because Detroit is a big city with a lot of people using. There's no reason to suspect that the fentanyl located there came from Canada. It probably reached Detroit from Mexico the same way any other large city in the interior of the United States has fentanyl seized in it also. So the three little counties that stood out, one was sort of a red herring, Okanagan County on the northern border of Washington State across from British Columbia, had...
And that's immediately below Vancouver, correct?
That was Whatcom County.
Okay.
It's easy to confuse these names, or I shouldn't give anyone a geography quiz. So we'll do Whatcom first. So Whatcom is just south of Vancouver on Interstate Highway 5. The quantities there were beyond what you would expect the residents of Whatcom County to need. That suggests there was a trafficking flow. There's also Okanagan County, where there was a relatively big seizure, but that was a Mexican-run organization. That appears just to be a Mexican organization that happened to be supplying people who live close to the Canadian border, including people in First Nations reservations. And then the most interesting really was Alaska. And we had never thought about it before, but where should Alaska get its fentanyl?
Preferably nowhere.
Good answer. But it's not easy to drive a car from Mexico to Alaska directly. So it's in some sense not too surprising that Alaska would perhaps be getting its fentanyl from Canada. But there aren't many people who live in Alaska. It's not a big market.
You mentioned Mexican cartels, and I've learned from our politicians that is a term that gets the Mexican government's back up. They don't like that. I guess none of us would like our country being associated with it, but they are cartels from Mexico, and there are Chinese triads coming in. I just learned recently about the cocaine cartel out of Ireland that now operates in Dubai. All of these groups are there, and can we assume that if it was Mexican cartel fentanyl in somewhere like Okanagan County on the Canada-U.S. border, that it came from Mexico, or that it came from the cartel operations in Canada? Because they've set up in your country, they set up in my country. I mean, they may have started in Mexico, but they operate across borders.
It's a good question. No, we cannot assume. And the nature of the data that we received just pertained to where it was seized. It doesn't have the full route. So it is possible that the drug seized in Okanagan County had been sent from Mexico to Canada and then down into Okanagan County across the border. That is possible.
Let's back up a little bit, because I've been watching the rise of fentanyl for over a decade. In our most recent mayoral election here in Toronto, like many major cities, we've got a lot of problems to do with homelessness, encampments, open drug use in the streets, societal decay. And I remember writing a piece that said pretty much all the major issues that we're dealing with, the gun crime, the shootings going up, can be tied back to, in some way, to fentanyl. Prior to fentanyl really taking off across North America in the early aughts, we were dealing with heroin as the main opioid. What makes fentanyl so lucrative and at the same time so addictive for the population? Because we're facing a very different crisis than we were when the opioid of choice was heroin or synthetic heroin.
So the short answer is it's cheaper. If you put yourself in the shoes of a high-level trafficker, perhaps in Mexico, and you're in the business of supplying illegal opioids to the North American market, the innovation of distributing fentanyl instead of heroin is just a way to radically reduce your cost of raw materials. The price per morphine equivalent dose is the jargon. Let me explain that. So there are many different opioids, everything from codeine to fentanyl and carfentanil. They're broadly similar but have different potencies, so we need a common unit to convert one to the other, and it's called a morphine equivalent dose. The cost per morphine equivalent dose for the high-level traffickers is maybe 1% with fentanyl what it was with heroin, so they just seized on the opportunity to save money. And also, it's more compact, so it's easier to smuggle. It's synthetic, so you can produce it quickly if it seized. A lot of advantages for them. And the main reason why things are worse is the price on the street is dropped by 90%, and people are using way more than they used to.
You You mentioned in your piece for the Manhattan Institute how uh, changing the price point can really alter an opioid market. And you pointed to the early 70s. I think one of them was the French Connection. I'm not talking about the movie, it was an actual event. Uh, Explain how that worked back then and why trying to interrupt these supply chains matters if you're going to try and solve the problem of the opioid addiction.
So back in the day, a lot of the heroin consumed in the United States was produced in the Middle East and passed through Marseille, France on the way to New York City and Montreal. And there were simultaneous actions both against the production in the Middle East and also against the French Connection. And yeah, the movie is based on real events. And because that pathway accounted for such a large share of heroin entering North America, breaking that route made a substantial difference. So for a year or two or a shade more, there was a relative scarcity. Prices spiked triple or quadruple what they had been. And that kind of broke the back of the heroin epidemic that got started in the late 1960s. So the shortage didn't last forever, but by the time the supply networks had reconstituted and developed other pathways, the momentum of that earlier heroin epidemic had been broken.
And so similar actions today could do the same thing, although this seems far more widespread than the heroin epidemic of the 1960s, early 70s.
You are correct. It is more widespread. Back then, New York City, and there was this New York City-Montreal connection going on.
This is part of the reason why so many Canadians got their backs up when Donald Trump said that they're part of it. And I thought, why would you get your back up instead of investigate? If you know anything about the New York City drug market, Montreal has been supplying it for decades. Whether it was the French Connection or the Rizzuto crime family in the 90s and early 2000s.
In fact, I'm in the process of listening to this wonderful long series of podcasts on Canadian history. I think it's 250 lectures in total, and there were stories about smuggling and border crossing to evade taxes in the late 18th and early 19th century. This had to do with evading customs duties and also figuring out the least expensive way to move furs from the interior to the European markets. So if the geography makes it make sense, right? The Hudson River Valley goes up and connects to Lake Champlain, which connects to the Richelieu River. It's actually been a transportation corridor, who knows, back almost to the time of Samuel de Champlain.
So the Montreal, New York corridor, you were going to say that back then New York City was smaller.
I'm sorry. Back then, New York City dominated the North American market. You were right. The market is just bigger and it's more diffuse. We could talk a little bit about why. The other big changes are technology today. At one time, it was not easy to have a phone conversation with somebody a continent away. Now, 12-year-old kids are playing video games with people they've never met on 3 different continents. So the communication capability, including encrypted communication, makes it so much easier to coordinate transcontinental shipments. And the drug trafficking usually hides within legitimate flows of people and goods, and international trade and international movements of people are just massively greater than they were, say, before the end of the Cold War. So it is way easier to move the stuff around, and that makes it much harder for law enforcement to create a sustained disruption. On the other hand, we are perhaps seeing one right at this moment, right? For the last 18 months or so, the fentanyl markets in both Canada and the United States seem to have been substantially shocked. Prices, there's less availability, there's fewer overdoses. We may be right at this moment in the middle of a shortage, relative shortage.
Before we get into potential enforcement measures, let's talk about how big this business is. I was writing the other day on a gentleman out of Vancouver area, Opinder Singh Sayan, who was arrested in Nevada. He had been, I guess, caught up in a sting operation by the Drug Enforcement Agency that started out of their office in Ankara, Turkey, put them in touch, put their confidential source that they wanted to plant into this international ring in touch with people who eventually put the confidential source in touch with Cyan and Surrey, who's promising to bring in fentanyl precursors from Hong Kong and mainland China through Vancouver or directly to the port of Long Beach, just outside Los Angeles. There are connections to the aforementioned Cahain Irish drug cartel. So you've got China, Turkey, the United States, Canada, China, all
Australia.
involved in this, and Australia, because yes, they were shipping fentanyl into the United States either directly or through Canada, and moving methamphetamine from Montreal through the port in Long Beach to Australia. These are big networks. How big is this business these days? Not this particular group, because you may not be able to answer that, but overall, this is big and lucrative business, isn't it?
100%. So the United States used to have this series of studies called What American Users Spend on Illegal Drugs. Unfortunately, they stopped updating the series. So the last year for which we have that data where it's a comprehensive estimate is 2016. But at that time, it was $150 billion a year that people who consume drugs were spending buying those illegal drugs, 150 billion. And now, most of that actually stays with the lower level dealers. It's a little bit paradoxical, but those street dealers who are not themselves very wealthy get a lot of that because the prices get bumped up each step of the distribution chain. But when you're talking about the level that you're speaking of, those high level traffickers, at that time, that would have been a $15 or $20 billion a year activity supporting U.S. markets. And, in round terms, Canada is about 1/8 the population of the United States. It wouldn't be surprising to me if the dollars involved in the Canadian market are roughly 1/8 what they are in the U.S. market.
So the multi-billion-dollar operation just for North America, excluding Mexico, well, even though technically, back to the geography lesson, they are part of North America.
Yeah. And some of that 150 billion that American drug users were spending to buy drugs would be flowing back into Mexico.
But so you would, I mean, given that fentanyl is lower, has the price that or the amount that people are spending overall gone down, or
Yeah, a bit.
or is it just more widespread and so omnipresent that it's gone up?
Um, It's an excellent question. It's a really good question. So in very, very round terms, the price per morphine equivalent dose, remember that's that unit that allows us to compare across opioids, has dropped by like 90%. And the number of morphine equivalent doses that the daily or near daily user who has opioid use disorder is consuming has gone way up. Maybe 5 times as much as before. So paradoxically, when you get this much cheaper drug, it's actually not increasing the dollar value of the market from those traditional users. But one of the things that fentanyl did is it expanded the user base. In the old heroin era, it was mostly injected, and a lot of people don't want to put a needle in their arm. But the fentanyl now is also distributed as counterfeit pills, and there are a lot of people who are willing to take a pill who would not want to inject.
Well, and then once they get addicted, my understanding is it turns to crushing the pills and injecting them, which has all kinds of medical ramifications that I've spoken to doctors about that just give me the heebie-jeebies. So, how does the business work, and why do instead of shipping fentanyl from China, which they used to do, and it's funny, we used to complain about fentanyl coming in from China to Canada by mail. Now, one of the complaints for how fentanyl gets from Canada to the United States and perhaps not caught at the border, and you allude to this a bit, is packages that don't come across the land border. Some of it's coming in by mail to the U.S. as well. But that's how they used to do it. Why are they now shipping precursors and having people make it at super labs either in the States or just across the Mexican border or in Canada? How does all of this work?
The short answer is we believe China did crack down on the fentanyl itself. And so the players in China shifted to making the precursors. And this is not an uncommon...
These are just ingredients?
No, I mean, yes and no. So a metaphor I use sometimes is baking a cake that's got frosting on it. And one image of producing cakes is you start with flour and sugar and egg. But another thing you can do is you could buy an unfrosted cake and then just add the frosting. A lot of these fentanyl precursors are more like the cake without the frosting, and then the only thing you need to do is add the frosting. So some of the precursors allow that final processing step to be relatively easy. So these can be super labs by quantity and importance, but they're not always super labs by technical sophistication. If you visit a super lab, you would not mistake it for an actual pharmaceutical company's lab in terms of...
But the photos and videos I've seen, it doesn't look like a James Bond villain went in there with one of these super clean things. You're talking about pails that you would get at Home Depot or the pickle pail from your local restaurant is what this stuff is made in.
Yes, and the person who's staffing that can either be just a trained laborer, or in Mexico, it's not uncommon that they'll recruit somebody with, say, a bachelor's degree in chemistry. They're not needing someone PhD trained, but sometimes it's useful to have someone who has some skill in a lab. One of the reasons why fentanyl stuck this time around, I should back up. There have been 3 or 4 previous instances in which fentanyl threatened to penetrate the U.S. market before what we're seeing now started, as you say, about 10 years ago. Those earlier attempts were cut short because law enforcement got on top of it before it spread. And one of the reasons it was easier to control then is that the synthesis methods required more technical sophistication. For instance, they might require you to control the temperature and pressure of the reactor vessel during the synthesis. But then simpler synthesis methods were discovered and the recipes disseminated on the internet. And now it is much closer to just mixed chemicals, not having to put them in a reactor that has a controlled temperature and pressure. So yeah, they're not super sophisticated.
But I never underestimate the resourcefulness of the criminal element.
Absolutely. They're creative. They adapt. A lot of the resourcefulness is in the distribution. It's in how do you locate and communicate with that person 3,000 miles away and who is not a trustworthy partner. So you referred to this particular case. One of the things that's fun about that is they're using dollar bills and the serial number on dollar bills as a way of validating that the person that they're meeting with is the same person they're talking with. So that's kind of clever. But it is not the production itself that is the most challenging part of the operation.
Let's talk about more about that case when we come back. We'll take a quick break here. More in moments.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
So, Professor Caulkins, you mentioned just before the break this document that we both read. It's the affidavit attached to the arrest warrant that was issued for Upinder Singh Sayan out of Surrey, British Columbia. And a lot of interesting tidbits. First off, the nicknames of the people in this, Queen and Burger and things like that, Triple A and Triple K. That's interesting. And if you're writing a movie about this, those would be some good elements to pull. But for a meetup and this wasn't to do with fentanyl, this was to do with meth, but these networks trade in all the drugs. They were also trading in cocaine as well. I'm sure there are others that just weren't mentioned. The way that you would validate that you were the right person for the pickup is by citing a serial number from a dollar bill. In another instance, they were unsure that the shipment of meth was still in the custody of the person they had given it to sell it to the Australians. And so they said, we want to see a photo of you with this holding today's edition of the LA Times. Seems unsophisticated in some ways, but these are the methods they're going to try and coordinate and ensure that they're not being tripped up by law enforcement, which they obviously were in this case.
Not being tripped up by law enforcement, but also not being tripped up by each other. One of the occupational risks of being a criminal is you're working with other criminals who are not necessarily reputable. So to stereotype 10 and 20 years ago, the trust challenge. How do I trust a business partner when it's an illegal transaction and they could always just pull a gun and steal the money that I brought or steal the drugs that I brought, depending on which side of the transaction I am? Or even more, how do I trust that if I send a shipment thousands of miles, the person receiving is going to pay? Or if you're the buyer, the seller might say, pay me first, but you as the buyer say, why should I pay you first? You might never ship the stuff. So there's a trust challenge. In olden times, the trust challenge was solved primarily by working within ethnic groups and often within families, sometimes by literally taking hostages. So the South American groups might send someone from their family into the United States. To make sure they didn't go rogue, they would generously host that person's family at their compound. And
That's a nice way of putting it.
If the person they sent to the United States ended up going rogue or whatever, then they have hostages. So those are like the old ways the drug trafficking networks worked. And it worked well enough, but it did limit to some degree the flows to operating on kind of traditional pathways and places where there were members of the same ethnic group on both sides of the international border. What we're seeing now with improved electronic communication is what you were referring to, these crazy mixes of many different nationalities in many different locations, trading in many different drugs, but they still have to solve that trust problem. And so the things you're talking about are some of the ways they try to deal with the trust problem when they're no longer working within ethnic and family ties.
Yeah, it can sound like a bit of a joke if you put it the right way. You know, an Irishman, a Turk, and a Mexican walk into a Chinese bar.
You're set. You're right. It's very cinematic, and now you've decided you can make this a comedy action thriller. I think you've got something going there.
It's it isn't what you would have expected years ago. You know, look, people can make fun of the movies and the books by people like Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola, but there were accuracies in them.
That book and that movie, they did a pretty good job of capturing it.
The bloodlines and how close you were and were you from the same neighborhood, that was all true. And now I was reading this affidavit by Officer Polito, and just my mind was blown. It is a very different setup. So you've got the Sinaloa cartel out of Mexico, the Caulkins out of Dublin via Dubai, and various organized crime elements in Canada and the United States buying from China. Which element is driving this? Is it the consumer, or, I mean, there'd been some political talk that it was a Chinese political decision to flood North America with fentanyl.
Yep.
That this is part of their overall strategy of domination is to, you know, if they can undermine the United States through this, then it helps them economically and eventually geopolitically, militarily.
So to answer the first part, at one level, it is ultimately demand driven. One of the things that's been fascinating in my research life for the last year is we've assembled experts on 10 different major illegal markets, not just drugs, but also money laundering, commercial sex, human smuggling. And they're all basically demand driven in the sense that the trafficking organizations don't have big marketing departments purchasing television ads, or they aren't trying to push their illegal product or service on the consumer. So at some level, it's demand driven. Your speculation that this was a plot by China, I don't know. I don't live in that Politburo. My best guess, and it's only a guess, is it wasn't something they planned way ahead of time, but once they realized it was happening, they were like, okay, this is something that we will only crack down on somewhat grudgingly, and to avoid the embarrassment of being the world's drug producer. They did take action in 2019 against the fentanyl itself, which forced the market to shift to precursors. They have taken some action within the last year or two also. But I don't know.
There was a drop, and you allude to that in your piece for the Manhattan Institute. There was a drop in opioid overdose deaths. I follow the British Columbia coroner's monthly updates, and I didn't realize that was why there was a dip in 2019, the only year that went down. And right now, I think we're probably headed to maybe a slight decrease this year, but still well above where things had been. It'll be lower than previous record years. So, there's the good and the bad on that. You mentioned money laundering, and I'd like to ask you about that. If we're not a big player in supplying, what's Canada's role in money laundering? We know that one of our big banks got their knuckles wrapped by American authorities, TD, which is, it's a Canadian bank, but wow, it's pretty big along the U.S. Eastern Seaboard now. And then we've got what are called the Vancouver model for money laundering. That's since been moved to Toronto. I can tell you the price of real estate is not doing well, in part due to this, part due to other issues. But how big is the money laundering here? If we're not selling the drugs, are we helping the cartels and the triads get their profits?
Very possibly. So, however difficult it is to have the global picture on what's going on with the drug trafficking, it's even harder to have really good data on the global picture of money laundering. But it does seem plausible to me that Canada's role in the money laundering side is relatively larger than, well, it's almost certainly going to be larger than Canada's role in having fentanyl shipments reach the United States, because the quantity coming from Canada to the United States is so small. A lot of that money laundering, the drive on the money laundering does come from two sides. One is it's criminal organizations in the final market countries like Canada and the United States having cash that they need to launder. The other big driver is people in China wanting to get money out of the country. So the currency controls in China create the other side of that. There's a lot of people in China who would be thrilled to acquire assets in North America.
Yeah, you can't necessarily leave with your money, but you can buy a house in North America.
Yeah, and then you can buy a house that needs to be fixed up, and then you can pay the contractors with the cash, which may have less than savory origins. Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about enforcement and what can be done. You mentioned that the tariff issue and whether that should be done, that's a political thing and not within your realm. But in terms of enforcement for getting a hold of this, and it is a scourge on both sides. I believe we've lost more people to opioid deaths driven primarily by fentanyl in the last decade than we lost in all of the Second World War. That's significant.
It's huge.
What, and similar numbers for the United States. So this is something that we should all be taking seriously, be trying to get a hold of. Beyond the deaths, there's the lives destroyed but still lived, and the impact on communities. So what are effective methods for interrupting those supply chains?
Rather than talk about tactics, you should talk to a law enforcement officer about the tactics, but let's talk about the objectives or strategy or the vision for what law enforcement can do. And I would say there's sort of 4 schools of thought. One school of thought is supply control is hopeless, worthless. The market will always respond, and it'll respond essentially immediately. All resources should just go on the demand side to treatment, harm reduction, and so on. That's one school of thought. I'm not that pessimistic. At the other extreme are the people who have what I think is wildly naive hopes and expectations about the ability to quote unquote seal the border, eliminate the market completely. I don't think that's realistic because these substances are so compact. They're very, very small. They're very easy to hide. So those 2 extremes I don't think make sense. One other view is to say we can shock a market if we get the right convergence of factors, sort of the perfect storm. And if that shock lasts a year or a year and a half, so that the number of people dying drops by 25% for a year and a half, that's thousands of lives. And let's just say that's what we're trying to do. So that's sort of shock the market approach. The fourth idea is to say, in 2025, it's really hard even to shock the market, let alone to shut it down. But what we can do is focus on the organizations that are most destructive, that create the most collateral harm. And this is a story that's easy to tell with regard to Mexico today. The organizations in Mexico are absolutely destructive to the fabric of Mexican society. They kidnap and kill people. They kidnap people for profit. They kill journalists to intimidate the press. They corrupt politicians. That's causing destruction in society above and beyond just the distributing of the drugs. So this fourth school of thought says, let's not put all drug traffickers in the same bin. Let's recognize that some of them are truly horrible in how they conduct their business, and others are just trying to conduct their business. And to say that the mission of law enforcement is to make sure that these powerful and wealthy organizations are not undermining democratic institutions, are not intimidating journalists, and so on. So those are 4 schools of thought, and I tend to be in the third and the fourth.
In terms of the third, as you were talking about shocking the market, one of the things that I was thinking about is that if we were to try that in certain parts of Canada, and I'm sure, if you went to Portland or other parts of Oregon, you might have the same issue. We have gone so far down the harm reduction only rabbit hole that, part of the illicit opioid supply now comes from harm reduction. Our elected officials and public health officials tried to deny this for years, but Thunder Bay, Ontario, way up north, is now supplied by harm reduction dillies coming out of London, Ontario. These pills, 8 milligram dilopioid, handed out, like a Pez dispenser, finding their ways up to Northern Ontario because they aren't flooded with the market up there, and it's very lucrative. Or in British Columbia, it's being fed into the Calgary market. That creates new opioid addicts who then eventually go to fentanyl. And my thought was, if we keep doing this and then try and shock the market to interrupt, I don't think that it would make a difference. I believe in the 4 pillars of dealing with illicit drugs, which includes harm reduction, but I don't believe that harm reduction is the only way to go, and that's where some of our leadership has been over the past several years.
Yeah, and let's be clear, harm reduction is a big tent concept that has many different specific programs in it. So for instance, naloxone distribution wouldn't have any of the effects you're talking about because naloxone just blocks an opioid. It doesn't trigger the opioid receptors. You're really referring more specifically to this prescribed safer supply concept, and which tremendously controversial and very strong opinions on all sides of this. But the one way to think about this is the real question is, do you supervise the consumption of the opioids that are being given by the medical system? With methadone in the United States, historically, we said, yes, we'll provide you with this other opioid called methadone, but you have to consume it on site. And the reason was there was a secondary illegal market in diverted methadone when people were allowed to take home in large quantities. And at some level, it's like not surprising. If the government gives away for free anything that has a resale market, doesn't have to be only opioids. If the government were giving away, I don't know, iPhones, then some people would say, thank you very much, I'm going to resell. And the temptation for reselling with prescribed safer supply is that those pills that are a controlled pharmaceutical dose sell for about triple per morphine equivalent dose what the unreliable illegal opioids sell for. So you could get a number of pills and then sell it for a number of dollars that allowed you to buy 3 times as many morphine equivalent doses of illegal opioids, mostly fentanyl, as the number of morphine equivalent doses that you receive from prescribed safer supply. So at some level, there's an arbitrage opportunity there. And unless you supervise the consumption, some people are going...
Which we don't.
My understanding is that also is contested. I've had people tell me that very little of it is supervised. Then I repeated those words and got yelled at by somebody who said, oh, no, it's all supervised. There are a lot of strong feelings about that.
But it's been a fascinating conversation, Professor Caulkins. I really do appreciate it.
I appreciate your interest.
There's been a lot of political points back and forth, and I think everyone's just trying to make themselves look best. You actually have the data, and we appreciate that. And your insights into illegal supply chains, which I just find fascinating.
It's been a wonderful profession for opportunities like this, and yes, it's a fascinating area. Criminals are fun to study.
Thanks for the time. We'll talk soon.
Have a good day.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please remember to hit subscribe wherever you get your podcast, on Amazon, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get them. And help us out by leaving us a rating and a review. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you. Castro would end up occupying a space in the Trudeau family similar to that of a beloved uncle. They went diving. They smoked cigars together. They gathered sea urchins for beach cookouts.
Informal talks at an island hideaway intensified their respect for each other, and their mutual enjoyment of skin diving added to the rapport.
In addition to a well-publicized 1976 summit meeting, Trudeau took 3 separate vacations to visit Castro after his time in politics had ended.
I can make, just one reference to Pierre Trudeau's sons to show the closeness of the relationship. The nickname that the Trudeau sons had for Fidel Castro was Papa Fidel. So that gives you an indication of the closeness of the bond that existed between a communist dictator, thorn in the side of every American administration for the past 50 years, and Pierre Trudeau.
When Trudeau's youngest son, Michel, died in an avalanche in 1998, Castro called the family in tears to express his condolences. As an 8-year-old, Michel had referred to Fidel Castro as his best friend. When Pierre died, Fidel declared 3 days of mourning in Cuba and flew to Montreal to act as an honorary pallbearer.
Every time Trudeau went down to Cuba, all the people in South Florida, the exiles, were thinking, why is this Western leader giving comfort to a murderous dictator, who is oppressing their people in Cuba, and saying, good things about Fidel Castro? And as I've mentioned, to have him in the pew at Trudeau's funeral in the front row, as a dignified person when he had been such a brutal leader, says more about Pierre Trudeau than it does about Fidel Castro.
Here's where we should probably touch on what Castro had done.
and what he was continuing to do while going on beach vacations with the Trudeau family.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What everywhere you get your podcasts.